The bell above the diner door chimed a thin, tinny announcement of her arrival. Every head in the narrow car turned, a wave of blatant curiosity that washed over Eleanor and made the skin on her bare arms prickle. The sleeveless red dress, which had felt bold and confident in her apartment mirror, now felt like a spotlight. She was late, terribly, unforgivably late for a blind date. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, a familiar companion. She scanned the worn vinyl booths, her eyes searching for a man alone. There, in the last booth, tucked into the corner where the shadows clung deepest, a man sat with an untouched cup of coffee. He was not looking at the door. His focus was on the street outside, a predator's stillness in a room full of tired conversation and clattering plates. He was preparing to leave. She knew it in the set of his shoulders, the way his long coat was draped over the seat beside him, ready to be seized. He was done waiting. However, this was the man she was here to meet. The man her well-meaning but hopelessly clueless friend had described as an importer with old-fashioned values. He looked less like an importer and more like he owned the port itself, along with every ship that dared to dock there. His suit was dark wool, so exquisitely tailored it seemed to absorb the cheap diner light and make it something richer. His hair was black, cut short and severe. Even from across the room, she could see the heavy weight of a gold signet ring on his smallest finger. He exuded a silence that was louder than any noise in the room. Eleanor took a breath, clutching the small, beautifully wrapped box in her hands, and started the long walk toward his booth. Each step felt measured, each scrape of her heel on the linoleum a confession of her tardiness. As she drew closer, he finally turned his head. His eyes, a shade of brown so dark they were almost black, met hers. There was no welcome in them, no flicker of interest. There was only a cold, flat assessment that made her feel like a column of figures he was summing up and finding wanting. "Marco?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He did not stand. He simply inclined his head, a gesture so minimal it was almost an insult. "You're late." The statement was not an accusation. It was a fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. "The subway," she began, the excuse sounding flimsy even to her own ears. "There was a signal problem at Canal Street. I'm so sorry." She slid into the booth opposite him. The vinyl was cool against her legs. The table between them felt like a mile of barren territory. In her hands, the small gift suddenly felt foolish, a childish offering to a king. "They're always having signal problems," he said, his gaze dropping to the box in her hands. "It's a predictable variable." Eleanor felt a flush of irritation cut through her nervousness. "Well, I'm a cartographer, not a city planner. I map what exists. I don't predict its failures." She pushed the box across the table toward him. "This is for you. Thank you for agreeing to this." His eyes lingered on the box, then rose to her face. He was looking for a trap. She could see the calculation in his gaze, the way he analyzed every angle before making a move. He made no effort to take the gift. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. She could feel the waitress watching them, the couple in the next booth pretending not to listen. This was a mistake, a huge, embarrassing mistake. Her friend was going to get an earful. "My friend said you appreciate things with history," Eleanor said, trying to fill the void. "Things that are well made." Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His hands were large, his fingers long and elegant, yet they moved with an unmistakable sense of power. He picked up the box. He did not shake it or examine the wrapping. He simply untied the silk ribbon with an economy of motion and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was an antique ruling pen. Its handle was polished ivory, yellowed with age, and its brass nib was intricate, designed for drawing lines of precise and unvarying width. It was a beautiful, obsolete tool from her world. A world of paper and ink, of fixed boundaries and known coastlines. He looked at it, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" "It's a ruling pen," she explained, relieved to be on familiar ground. "From the late 19th century. Cartographers used them to ink final maps. You fill the nib with ink, and you can draw a perfect line. Consistent, unwavering. He picked it up, testing its weight in his palm. He ran a thumb over the cool ivory, his touch surprisingly gentle. For the first time, a flicker of something other than dismissal crossed his face. It was not interest. It was something closer to recognition, as if he understood the language of the object, if not the object itself. A tool for drawing lines, for defining territory. That was when the bell on the door chimed again. Two men walked in. They were big, dressed in cheap leather jackets that strained across their shoulders. They moved with a swagger that was meant to command space, but it was clumsy, undisciplined. They were looking for someone. Their eyes swept the diner, predatory and loud. Eleanor saw them, and a primal instinct, the one that tells you when the weather is about to turn, screamed inside her head. She saw the way the other patrons shrank in their seats, the way the waitress suddenly became very busy wiping down a clean counter. Marco saw her notice. His eyes snapped from the pen to her face, and the air between them instantly changed. It became charged, thin. He placed the pen carefully back in its box and slid it to the side. Then he laid his hand flat on the table. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a claim. The two men were getting closer. One of them spotted Marco, and a slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He nudged his companion, and they changed course, heading directly for their booth. Marco did not look at them. His gaze was locked on Eleanor. He slowly reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, heavy, the pressure both a comfort and a command. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not even breathe. She had thought this was a date. A painfully awkward, possibly disastrous date. But the world she was in was not a diner. It was a negotiation table. It was a front line in a war she hadn't even known existed. And now, with his hand covering hers and two dangerous men closing in, she understood she could not leave. She had been seen with him. On the map of his world, she was now a landmark. Target. The taller of the two men stopped at their table, hooking his thumbs into his belt. Marco. Fancy seeing you here. Slumming it? Marco finally lifted his eyes from Eleanor's face and looked at the man. His expression was utterly blank. I'm having a conversation, Tony. It's a private 1-inch. Tony's eyes slid to Eleanor, a greasy appraisal that traveled from her face, down the line of her neck, to the curve of her body visible above the table. She your new accountant? Looks a little soft for your kind of numbers. The pressure of Marco's hand on hers increased infinitesimally. It was not a squeeze of reassurance. It was a warning. The temperature around their table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Her name is not your concern, Marco said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that cut through the diner's ambient noise. And neither is my business. You're a long way from your territory. Maybe we're looking to expand, the second man grunted, leaning his knuckles on their table. That would be a mistake, Marco said. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, as simple and certain as his earlier comment about the subway. He slid his hand from Eleanor's and picked up his coffee cup. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Tony's. The gesture was so calm, so utterly dismissive, it was more menacing than any shouted threat could ever be. Tony's face flushed a dark, angry red. He glanced around the diner, at the faces staring into their plates, at the waitress frozen by the coffee machine. He had lost control of the room. Marco had taken it from him without raising his voice or standing up. This ain't over, Tony snarled, a final, impotent show of aggression. It was never begun, Marco replied, setting his cup down with a soft click. He pulled a few bills from his wallet and laid them on the table. We're leaving. He slid out of the booth and stood, his height and presence seeming to diminish the two other men instantly. He looked down at Eleanor, his expression unreadable. Come? It was not a request. She fumbled with her purse, her hands trembling slightly, and slid out of the booth to join him. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that felt less like chivalry and more like he was moving a valuable piece on a chessboard. He guided her past Tony and his friend, who parted before them like water before the bow of a ship. Outside, the cool night air was a shock. The city lights seemed too bright, the sounds of traffic too loud after the compressed tension of the diner. A black sedan with tinted windows was parked at the curb, its engine humming quietly. It hadn't been there when she arrived. A man in a dark suit stood by the rear door, opening it as they approached. "Get in," Marco said. "I can get a cab," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "My apartment is just." "You are not going to your apartment." He cut her off, his voice hard. "They saw you. They know your face. Your apartment is the first place they will look." The reality of her situation landed with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a movie. This was real. "Look for what? I don't know anything." "You know me," he said, his dark eyes boring into hers. "In my world, that is more than enough. Get in the car, Eleanor." He said her name. He had not used it in the diner, but he used it now, and the sound of it in his mouth was different. It sounded possessive, claimed. She got in the car. The ride was silent. She stared out the window at the familiar streets of her city, but they looked alien now, overlaid with a new, invisible map of danger and territory. He took her not to a hotel, but to a sleek, modern high-rise overlooking the river. The apartment was vast and minimalist, all glass and steel and shades of gray. It was as cold and controlled as he was. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if she wanted one and handed a glass to her. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt, sharp and unwelcome, went through her. "You will stay here tonight," he said, moving to the wall of windows and looking out at the glittering city. "Tomorrow my men will clear out your apartment. We will find you a new 1-inch. "A new one?" she whispered, horrified. "My work, my maps. I can't just leave." "Your maps are paper," he said, turning to face her. "They can be replaced. You cannot." He was on the phone for the next hour, his voice low and sharp, speaking in English but with a cadence that suggested it was a thin veneer over another language. She heard him say a name, Leo, in a tone that was tight with old, cold grief. When he was done, he seemed to notice her for the first time since they had arrived. She was huddled on a massive gray sofa, the whiskey untouched in her hand. The small, wrapped box with the ruling pen sat on the glass coffee table between them. He walked over and picked up the pen again, turning it over in his hands. "My brother," he said, his voice rough. "Leo." He used to draw. Not maps. Buildings. He was going to be an architect. We were going to build things. Legitimate things. He paused, his thumb tracing the ivory handle. "He was killed. A betrayal I should have seen coming. A line I didn't draw correctly." The confession hung in the air, raw and unguarded. It was the first crack in his marble facade. Eleanor saw the wound he carried, the adult he had failed to protect, and something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but now it had company, a strange, unwelcome flicker of empathy. She could have stayed silent. She could have tried to find a way to run. Instead, she found her voice. "I'm restoring a map at the archives," she said softly. "From 1890. It shows the original shoreline of this city, before the landfill. It shows all the old waterways and canals that are buried under the streets now. Hidden paths no one remembers." He looked up from the pen, his eyes locking on hers. He was listening, really listening. "People think a map is a fixed thing," she continued, finding her rhythm. "But it's not. It's a story of power. Who got to draw the lines? Who got to name the streets? Who was written into the landscape and who was written out?" He walked over to a large, flat-top desk and unrolled a modern map of the city. It was covered in his own markings. Areas circled in red, routes traced in blue. It was his territory, his war. He beckoned her over with a nod of his head. She stood beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, to smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and expensive wool. He pointed to a section of the map, an industrial area near the docks controlled by the family Tony belonged to. "Show me," he said, his voice a low command. "Show me a hidden path." And just like that, she was no longer a victim. She was a consultant. She had stayed, she had engaged, and therefore she had crossed a line. She picked up a pencil, her hand steady now, and began to draw. The next few days were a blur of contained fear and strange intimacy. Marco's men, quiet and efficient, had packed up her entire life, moving her books, her tools, and her rolled maps into a spare room in the penthouse. Her old life was gone, erased. Her new one existed entirely within these glass walls, high above the city she used to chart. He was a creature of routine and control. He would leave before dawn and return long after dark. They rarely spoke, but his presence filled the apartment. She found herself learning the sound of his key in the lock, the soft tread of his expensive shoes on the polished concrete floors. She would leave a pot of coffee on for him, and in the morning, the empty pot would be rinsed and waiting by the sink. It was a silent, domestic rhythm at odds with the lethal reality of their situation. The threat, however, was not silent. One afternoon, a call came from her supervisor at the archives. Package had been left for her. It was a shoebox. Inside was a dead pigeon, its neck broken. A message, crude but unmistakable. "We know where you work. We know what you care about." That night, Marco came home earlier than usual. He found her in the spare room, her maps spread out across the floor, her hands covered in charcoal as she worked on a restoration. He didn't say a word about the bird. He just stood in the doorway and watched her. "They're threatening to burn it down," she said, not looking up. "The archives. My supervisor told me the police found accelerants in a dumpster out back." "They won't," he said. "You don't know that." "I do," he said, his voice absolute. "Because tonight, we are removing them from the map." He brought her to the large table in the main room, where the map of the city was permanently spread. He pointed again to the rival family's territory. "The main warehouse. This is where their entire operation is run from. Drugs, weapons, money. We take this, we cripple them." Eleanor stared at the map. Her mind went back to the old charts she had spent years studying, to the forgotten layers of the city. "There's a tunnel," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "An old pneumatic mail tube, abandoned in the 1950s. It's not on any modern schematic. But it runs right under here." She traced a faint, dotted line with her finger. A ghost path that led directly beneath the heart of the warehouse. Giving him this information was not a passive act. It was pulling a trigger. It was a choice. She was drawing a battle plan. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. This was the line she could not uncross. He looked from the line she had drawn to her face. His expression was intense, searching. He did not thank her. "You see things other people don't," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a diagnosis. "You told me to leave that night," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "In the diner. You gave me a chance to walk away. And you stayed," he replied, his voice a low murmur. "Why?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "You didn't mean it." The silence that followed was the most honest conversation they had ever had. It was a confession from both of them. He had not wanted her to go, and she had not been able to leave. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm against her skin, the touch shockingly gentle. It was the first time he had touched her since that night in the diner. It was a claim, made in the quiet of his fortress, over a map of a city he intended to conquer. The plan was for a surgical strike. Fast, quiet, and decisive, using the tunnel she had found. But as his men were preparing to leave, Marco's phone rang. He listened, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "It was a feint," he said, hanging up. "The warehouse is mostly empty. Tony isn't there." "Then where is he?" Eleanor asked, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Marco's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a chilling certainty. He's at the archives. He's not going after my territory. He's going after yours. They raced through the city, the sedan a black arrow in the night. Eleanor's mind was working. Clicking through blueprints and floor plans she knew better than her own reflection. He'll go in through the main entrance. Security is weakest there. But there's another way. A receiving door for the conservation department in the subbasement. It's not on the public plans. Marco looked at the driver. You heard her. The car swerved, tires screaming, and took a series of sharp turns that left Eleanor pressed against him. He was a wall of solid muscle and resolve. He did not put his arm around her. He simply existed, a bulwark against the chaos. At the archives, the smell of smoke was already thick in the air. Marco's men moved with silent, brutal efficiency, disabling the few security guards and securing the perimeter. Stay here, Marco ordered her. No, she said, her voice firm. You don't know the layout. There are fire suppression systems, but they have to be triggered manually from the conservation office. I'm the only one who knows how. She was not asking. She was stating a fact. He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. With me. Inside, the building was a nightmare of smoke and flickering emergency lights. They found Tony and two of his men in the main reading room, splashing gasoline on centuries-old books. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Gunshots echoed in the hallowed space, shockingly loud. While Marco and his men engaged them, Eleanor broke away, running on pure adrenaline. She knew these halls. She scrambled through the smoke, her lungs burning, to the conservation office. Her hands, slick with sweat, found the control panel. She slammed her palm on the large red button for the rare documents vault. There was a loud hiss, and a torrent of white halon gas flooded the adjacent room, sucking the oxygen from the air and extinguishing the flames that were just beginning to lick at the priceless manuscripts. The sudden release created a thick, disorienting fog, adding to the chaos and giving Marco the advantage he needed. She had acted. She had saved her world. When it was over, and the only sounds were the dripping of the sprinklers and the ragged breathing of the men, Marco found her. She was standing in the doorway of the vault, covered in soot, staring at the damage. He walked up to her, his own suit singed, a cut bleeding freely above his eye. He looked at the mess, the water and foam covering history. Then he looked at her. He reached out and touched the sleeve of her red dress. My brother would have liked you, he said, his voice raw. You protect things. He paused, his gaze holding hers, absolute and unwavering. Anything in this city you want to protect, you tell me. It's yours. It was not a declaration of love. It was an oath, a transfer of deeds. In his world, it was the most sacred vow he could make. Weeks passed. The archives were closed for restoration. Her old life was officially a ruin. Her new life was in his penthouse. It was no longer a prison, but it was not yet a home. It was a territory they were negotiating. One evening, she came into the living room to find him standing over the large table. An antique map was spread across it, its vellum yellowed and cracked. It was a map of Sicily. Next to it, gleaming in the lamplight, was the ivory-handled ruling pen she had given him. He did not seem surprised to see her. He gestured for her to come closer. This is where it began, he said, pointing to a small, coastal village carved into a mountainside. My family's line was drawn here. She looked at the ancient, hand-drawn lines, the faded ink that represented generations of power and blood. She looked at his hand, resting near the edge of the map, the gold signet ring a small, solid anchor. She did not take his hand. She did not say a word. Instead, she reached out and placed her own hand flat on the map, next to his. Her fingers rested on an unmarked stretch of coastline, a place with no name, no history, a place waiting to be charted. It was a choice, a silent answer. In the quiet of the room, high above the city, she was drawing a new map. And on this one, for the first time, she was not alone.